I'm not sure the program was fixed, so it was an attempt between Bologna and
Do that.
Good enough, more than good enough.
More than-
98% there. You're perfect.
Do that. All right, we should get started.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you have? Do you see anybody outside?
Yeah.
Just get them in. Okay. Okay, you have that array. Let me capture you.
Yeah, maybe that tells you something about the scene and it's like
when I just showed us last night.
oh, we had a good time today.
Yeah.
All right. Oops. Okay. Let's welcome our second speakers, Charles Pence, and from UC Louvain.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. This has been already a ball, and did I do that?
Oh, sorry, I did it. I'm just, yeah.
Yeah, this has been really great, and I'm excited to get to talk about this stuff. This is an open project, or an ongoing project with a postdoc in my research group. So comments, questions, ideas, etc., all super welcome. Let me run over what we're just scrolling down.
Well, okay, so.
Oh, there it is. We're good to see. So let me go over.
Sorry, I need to move that way. Okay.
Let me go over what I'm going to do. So what this project is we're trying to think about how to use some of the tools of digital humanities to explore questions of disagreement in science. And so I'm going to start by giving you some background, going over kind of what am I talking about. So in research on biodiversity and taxonomy, historically there's quite a bit of pretty ambiguous concepts and pretty heavy disagreement between practitioners in science. I'll present some ideas that philosophers have had for what to do about it, how to resolve or ignore sometimes this disagreement. What I want to sell you on, though, is the idea that this is a place where empirical analysis can be really important. So we've built a corpus of taxonomy articles, and we're trying to figure out, so where actually is the disagreement? Which people disagree? What do they disagree about? When and why do they disagree? Which is something that you might think would be pretty fundamental to an analysis of scientific disagreement. So I'm going to show you what we've done so far, some ideas that we've had, some stuff that we want to do, et cetera, et cetera. In general, the sort of take-home message is, yeah, people tend to think that this disagreement is common and bad. And what I want to at least try to argue for is that that's a testable empirical claim. So we can go actually see how common it is, and we can even, I hope, start to see, does it actually make trouble or not, really? Okay, so yeah, literature on biodiversity and taxonomy. So let me start, for those of you, if you don't know anything about the philosophy of biology literature on this, it's very big and very old. Well, that's a lie. It's old. It's as old as the concept. The concept of biodiversity actually is not that old, which is why I caught myself. It was coined in the late 1980s or the early 1990s to try to capture something or other about the diversity of life. The interesting problem is that it's often defined in a very, very loose way. So very often, biodiversity is one of these concepts that we say, you'll know it when you see it. So it's that stuff, right? That's biodiversity. Or maybe it's that stuff, right? But in any event, very often it plays this kind of catch-all role. It's a sort of generic term for something that we, I don't know, want to be able to save. At least in some sense, this is actually kind of a contradiction or a tension that's inherent to the concept itself. And it's inherent to the concept itself precisely because biodiversity needs to pick out something pretty specific. So it needs to be bigger than just what we sometimes call charismatic megafauna. So the classic way that conservation science started is saying, oh, we should save pandas and whales and stuff, right? I mean, that's good and that's important and we should do that, but we also now think that ecological relations at a much larger scale are extremely important as well, and just saving things like pandas and whales is not good enough to save them. On the other hand, we need to say something smaller than just save everything everywhere all the time, all of life is good, even if that's true. Because we want this to be an actionable concept, a practically useful concept. It needs to tell us something that's actually possible to say, that's meaningful for a very practical orientation in conservation. And so that's meant that for many years now, the way that scientists think about biodiversity is they think about chasing indicators of biodiversity. So how can we quantify an indicator of what it would mean for this area, or this ecosystem, or this region to be biodiverse? And the most common is what we call species richness. So that's just count the number of species in an area. The more you add, the more diverse you are. Normally that works pretty well. You need to mess with it a little bit, probably. You need to correct for the fact that you'd rather have, whatever, all else equal, 3 distant species is better than 3 species of ants, right? So you also want to catch a lot of distance. How exactly to do that's a little complicated, but that's the basic idea. Instead of species, so I should say at the outset, this first one, this is by far the most common. This is the most common approach. And so it's very usual that would be what would be in most textbooks in ecology today. But you don't have to take that tack. You can say, oh, we want to save something like the diversity of traits or characters, right? Because we care about the diversity of what evolution has built, what kinds of solutions to problems have been found in the tree of life. You could look at structural properties, like the structures of ecological communities. You could say, oh, we want to preserve a lot of different kinds of structures. You could look at the ecological niche and say, okay, well, if natural selection is good at filling niches, then maybe the more niches you have, the more biodiversity you have. It's kind of a proxy measure. And increasingly popular in our time now, especially with the widespread proliferation of low-cost, high-throughput gene sequencing, you can just say diversity of genetics, right? Diversity of genetic sequences. Just throw everything to a gene sequencer, figure out how many different kinds of gene sequences you have, you're done. Zooming back in for a second to this question of species richness, right? Species richness and any other concept that makes reference to species has yet another layer of ambiguity that it has to deal with, because as I think probably many of you know in the room, there's a huge amount, first of all, of disagreement just found in taxonomy itself. So taxonomists disagree about where are the species, which groups of organisms should count as a species, and in part that comes from the very classic philosophy of biology problem. The species problem, what is the definition of the word species? For which there are about 15 major candidate theories or so. And we have no idea which one is right. or if we should be pluralists, and some are right in some contexts, and that question is badly formed. So, you even have, this is always like, this is great red meat for a philosopher of science, right? This is a snippet from a science article in the journal Science, and this is two scientists saying that there's anarchy in taxonomy, and it's a problem because it interferes with our ability to do conservation biology. So again, this was the kind of first basic background bit I wanted to show you, right? The idea is a bunch of disagreement, a bunch of ambiguity in taxonomy and conservation biology surrounding taxonomy itself, as well as the concept of biodiversity. What do we do about it? So I want to briefly canvass some solutions that have been proposed already in the literature by different philosophers for the right way to respond to this kind of disorders. Again, to give you an idea of what the philosophical community is saying about this stuff. The first response is what I'm going to call here fundamentalism, and that's just to say that we have to respond to this ambiguity by destroying it. So we must find one definition of species, one definition of biodiversity. We must get the practitioners to agree. We have to force agreement around a common vocabulary. Beckett Sterner et al. Here, and I want to be very clear, every time I present this, I have to be cautious. They're presenting the definitional consensus principle. They do not agree with it, but they are presenting it. So just to be very explicit. But they say here they're looking through the lens of big data biology, but they note that it's often a foundational principle in big data biology, of which, of course, taxonomy and systematics is part. That we need to start from a consensus about the definitions of the entities that are being classified. If you're doing big data biology, this makes sense, right? Because you want a database that can interoperate with all the other databases. The only way you get there is if your vocabulary, your ontology, but now in the computer scientist sense of ontology, right? Not the philosopher's sense of ontology. If your ontology is clear about what are the entities, what are the properties, et cetera, what are we actually doing when we do this? And this is, I want to be very clear because I'm going to sound kind of negative at times about this fundamentalist response, and in point of fact, the paper's not out yet. Like any minute now, I'm going to be in print saying that I think this is wrong. So it could come out at any moment. It's like in typeset. But I do think this is a very important and very old response to ambiguity in communication. And I love being able to quote Aristotle. It's like I do contemporary, really dirty philosophy of science, so I can never quote Aristotle, right? But like, look, here's Aristotle in the rhetoric. It's like we can start from what I said in the Poetics, and the stipulation that language to be good must be clear, as is proved by the fact that speech which fails to convey a plain meaning will fail to do just what speech has to do. So the very definitional characteristic of a successful speech act is to communicate an unambiguous meaning, according to Aristotle in the rhetoric. So there's a nice pedigree for this view that the correct response here needs to be no more ambiguity. We have to get past this. The other kind of pretty radical response that you could say, you could turn to, is to become skeptical about the idea. Become skeptical about the notion of biodiversity, or to become skeptical about the notion of one singular taxonomy in the first place. Especially in the case of biodiversity, that's really common. So here you have someone like Sarkar, who argues at one point, put bluntly, the position of this paper will argue for is that biodiversity is to be implicitly defined as what is being conserved by the practice of conservation biology. And to be very clear, coming back a bit to what we were talking about appeals to practice in the last talk, right? He doesn't mean this in the sense of like, we're going to carefully reconstruct practice, right? He means this to be very negative. He's like, this is just a thin notion. It's just whatever I want to save today, I'm going to call it biodiversity. It's like a practically an empty term, right? And as far as I'm concerned, that's a very skeptical way to reply here, right? It's just like, whatever, the scientists are just using this as a kind of label, makes them feel good. More provocatively, one of my favorite paper titles, Carlos Santana, other Carlos Santana, wrote a lovely paper entitled Save the Planet, Eliminate Biodiversity. And his point here is a really lovely paper, actually. Again, I'm in real disagreeing with it, but everybody go read this. He argues that what you need to do, as a matter of fact, is stop talking about this. The reason that you need to stop talking about this is that using the word biodiversity as a kind of unifying term is actually stopping us from talking about what we actually care about. That is to say, if we just say, oh, it's biodiversity and everybody likes biodiversity, then we're not having an argument about what do I really value? What do I really want to conserve? I'm just saying, oh, biodiversity, right? Instead, we should actually do the detailed work to say, what do I value in the environment? Why do I want to preserve it? How can I do it in this particular circumstance? His claim is that's going to be different in different contexts or require different arguments. We should just accept that. A third response, the response of the postdoc on the project here, this is obviously well before he was working with me though. Stein Cummings has done fantastic work on this stuff. I owe a lot to him, extreme applause in Stein's direction, is to tie this to values in science literature. And to say that one way to look at this ambiguity is to say that where the ambiguity comes from is really about non-epistemic value judgments. It's about how we integrate the reasons for which we do conservation, many of which are not directly epistemic, right, into our practice. And this, again, has a pedigree. This is Soule in the article that basically invents the idea of conservation biology, more or less, as a scientific discipline. He writes, everybody quotes this, you may have seen it before. Conservation biology differs from most other biological sciences in one important way. It is often a crisis discipline. Its relation to biology, particularly ecology, is analogous to that of surgery to physiology and war to political science. In crisis disciplines, one must act before knowing all the facts. Crisis disciplines are thus a mixture of science and art, and their pursuit requires intuition as well as information. And right, so the idea of this third response is, this means you just have to, again, acknowledge that we're doing a value-laden thing, a really explicitly value-laden thing, a thing that the guy who invented the word said was like warfare or surgery. And so once you do that, you'll be a little bit better equipped, the claimants anyway, to understand what's happening in case of conservation. There's a response that biologists often have. I'm going to go quick through this, it's not that important, it's just kind of interesting. Biologists, when I say that, often respond that maybe there's ethics in conservation, sure, but it seems like you should keep the ethics out of taxonomy. You should keep taxonomy a kind of value-free enterprise that tells you what the world is made out of. But exactly what people like Stein have been trying to toy with in recent years, I think with a lot of success, is to take seriously the possibility that taxonomy might be just as value-laden as conservation, that species classifications aren't free from the impact of values. Elsewhere in the kind of larger research project, that my research project is interacting with, we have colleagues in Flanders, a project that's I think just finishing about now. They're doing this by trying to think about case studies. So here's an interesting, a really cool case study. They tried to think about, to really dig into the literature where people disagree about orchids in Europe. Orchid taxonomy is crazy, in part because orchids, I didn't know this, orchid taxonomy is still done by like amateurs on the weekends. So you could like go out in a field in Belgium and like try to find new species and maybe succeed and get published in a journal, which is cool and weird. But they went and really dug into examples in the literature of people disagreeing about orchid taxonomy to try to find out why. They're also in the middle of running surveys. So sent around sort of little vignettes, a vignette study, for those of you who know what a vignette study is. They sent around vignettes to everybody to be like, if you saw this species classification, what would you think about it? Would you think it was reasonable or not? Really cool stuff. I don't have final data in any way. This isn't my project, so I'm not qualified to enter into the details of their research. But hopefully that will help us get a better handle on whether this third response is empirically reasonable. Okay, so that's some of the ways that philosophers have played with this kind of stuff already. Yeah, that gives you an idea of the lay of the land in the philosophical community. Again, though, I think one thing that bears repeating is we don't have in any of that literature, I think, a sort of serious questioning of the presupposition that we started with, namely disagreement is everywhere, and disagreement is anarchy, bad, scary problem thing. That whatever you think we should do with that disagreement, the idea that it exists and the idea that it's problematic seems to be pretty pervasive in the philosophy literature. And so this pushed us to think, well, what can we do? Those of you who know me will know I've been working for a number of years now in the application of digital humanities tools in philosophy. We've been doing a lot of textual analysis of scientific journal literature. And so what we did is we said, okay, we can try to tackle this. The first thing that you need if you want to tackle this is a corpus. And so we went out and we built a corpus. Here's the journals. Major contribution from the open access articles at Pence. Also, hat tip, thank you to Magnolia Press for, well, I mean, hat tip, for letting us spend a lot of money with them to do this analysis, for having the grace to take our money, and a few other journals as well. We get to about 40,000 journal articles here. Yeah, if you just want to like when we're drinking wine on the roof after, just ask me about copyright. And you get me like 3 glasses of wine and ask me about copyright, and I'll just be angry. So like, no, it's fine. Anyway, about 40,000 articles. What kinds of journals are these? These are really, really intense taxonomy journals, by which I mean these are the journals that you put a paper in if you are like, I found a new frog. Here is the name of the frog. This is what it looks like. This is why it's not the same as the other frogs. It is the real, like, nuts and bolts details of doing taxonomy. And that was our point. If they also avoid, another big place that you might run aground here, this is almost all extant organisms. So there's no fossil taxonomy in here, because fossil taxonomy is its own utter nightmare that raises a bunch of other different and interesting problems. We only are worried for now about taxonomy of stuff that's currently around. Just to kind of give you an idea of how this corpus lays out, a bit unsurprising probably, here it is graphed over time. My apologies for extremely, extremely tiny axis labels, or axis markers and no axis labels. If there's a scientist in the room, you're allowed to punch me afterwards. It's like undergraduate stuff, come on. Anyway, this is year on the bottom across the x-axis from 1985 to 2020, and it's just the number of articles, which runs from 0 to 4,000 a year. Unsurprisingly, for journals that are largely digitally published, which is generally the case in contemporary taxonomy, this point of explosion here is about 2,000. And you get up to about 3,500 articles a year before you get into a recency problem, because we didn't get it. We downloaded the articles a couple of years ago, right? So we don't have very, very recent stuff. I don't think that's a problem because I don't think the discipline is radically changing. So I don't think this is really a big issue. Next thing that you might want to do is you might want to validate a corpus like this, right? So how do I know that this is a reasonable cross-section of contemporary taxonomic work? What could I do to figure that out? There's a lot of things I can do to figure it out. One thing that's really hard, though, is you have a very funny, this almost like a Kantian problem of like not being able to access the Newman or something, right? Like we don't know how many species there really are, right? The only way that we know how many species there really are is to consult the work of taxonomists. And this is the work of taxonomists. So like I can't step outside the hermeneutic circle, right? One thing I can do, at least the best thing and I should say, there are people who have claimed to have estimated the real number of species in the world. Their estimates for most major groups differ by about 5 orders of magnitude, depending on who you talk to. That's not real. What you can do is you can do something like this. This is a graph of the complete Open Tree of Life. And the Open Tree of Life is an online synthetic project that tries to take all taxonomic work that we know of and root it in one single tree of life. So this is every species that's been registered in the Open Tree of Life. The colors are by kind of vague, large groups, colloquial named groups. So in gold here we have bacteria, green is plants, yellow is fungi, you got chordates in pink, blue is annelids and mollusks, worms and mollusks. And unsurprisingly for those of you who know open taxonomy, but orange is all the arthropods, so insects and crustaceans, because there's more insects on Earth than there is anything else. Or kinds of, anyway. So one thing you can do is you do this, and then you can run through that corpus, and delightfully enough, there's a beautiful tool for this that works really well, and take every species name that I see in all 40,000 of those articles, and I can make a tree of life out of them. And it looks like this. And this is good and bad. So one thing that you'll notice, right, bacteria went away almost entirely. And that's to be expected because, again, like fossils, microbial taxonomy is a train wreck. If you don't know, the problem with bacteria, right, the nice thing about species and almost everything else is that we have sex in a reasonable way. We don't just crossbreed with every living thing on the planet. All bacteria everywhere are all having sex all the time. And so cutting them up into species is a nightmare. They transfer genes amongst one another with an astounding rate. So I'm actually kind of happy that I don't have bacteria because bacterial taxonomy is going to mess up my data. That's cool. I'm a little low on plants. The scary one is that you see this little tiny sliver of yellow, the fungi are gone, and that's bad. In talking to my biologist colleagues, I can't do anything about that for the following reason. Fungal taxonomy tends to be published, hilariously enough, in small regional journals. So it would be like, you know, the North German Mycological Society journal published out of some dude's basement in Hanover. And like, I'm never gonna get that, right? I'm done. So fungi may be gone forever. And I have to think about whether I think that's a bias that I need to account for in my research. Of course, more chordates than you would expect because chordates are charismatic and pretty and interesting. So everybody, in particular, I haven't run these numbers. I'm betting a lot more birds. Everybody likes birds. Taxonomists love birds. There's so much bird taxonomy. But otherwise, like, this isn't bad, right? I'm giving this like a 4 out of 5 stars in terms of representativeness. Like, I'm pretty okay with events as they're unfolding. So here's a slightly different way to look at those species occurrence counts. Again, tiny text, I apologize. Insects and non-insect arthropods, the two biggest groups, unsurprisingly, divided a little bit more finely than the tree of life is. Plants, other invertebrates, mollusks, fish, reptiles, birds, fungi, mammals, and then single-celled stuff that I am not going to. So, not bad, right? Not bad. Yeah.
So I think we got a quick.
Oh, yeah, cool. Sorry, thanks.
Can you just sit up there?
So there's a really cool program that will actually work through a plain text font developed by bioinformaticians. And it uses a Bayesian classifier to look for things that look like species names. And then it queries online databases of species to confirm whether they're actually species names. And then it gives you a really finely curated list of all the species that your paper talks about. And so I did that with all 40,000 articles. And then I made that into a tree.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's the same data source for this here. It's the same list of species for this graph here. Yeah, this should be, with luck, every species name that's mentioned in all 40,000 of those papers. Yeah.
Quick follow-up, so it's the whole paper or only the answer?
Thank you. I have full text, which is why I had to spend ungodly amounts of money with that one. Yeah, actually not me. It came from the Flemish side, so that was exciting.
Charles, I
yeah.
wanted to remind you that you're being recorded.
It's all right. It's nothing I haven't heard before. They know. I don't think it's anything that some of my colleagues probably don't know. What do we do with it? What else can we do with it? Because I think, so now, if I'm happy with my corpus, and I'm pretty happy with my corpus, what can I do? And here's where the text analysis part starts. So a brief introduction to the first text analysis tool that we use, topic modeling. So for those of you who've never heard of topic modeling ever, the idea is to take text and in an unsupervised way, so I don't have to tell it about the content of the journal beforehand, it will cut the corpus up into subjects or topics. It will tell me how do those subjects appear in each of the articles in the corpus. A bit more nerdy way to put it, but it's a kind of dimensionality reduction algorithm, right? So we start with documents, we pretend like they're vectors in a 172 million dimensional space. That's the number of word types in the 40,000 documents. So we make every document be a vector based on its frequency of using every kind of word that it might use. And we squish that down to 125 dimensions using a clever algorithm. I can say a lot more about that in the Q&A. If you want more technical detail, there's another way to present this that's also kind of interesting and cool. Let me know later. For now, I think the easiest thing is for me to show you what it gives you. So what does it give you? What you get out of the model, I have 125 of them, is a probability distribution over every word type. And then what you do is you look at what are the words that are most likely to be selected by this topic. So what are the most probable words in a topic? And you just read them. That's how you usually do most topic interpretation. And so imagine you're me and you're scrolling down here. I did a brief correlation analysis just to see what kinds of species show up in documents where topic 16 is often mentioned. The answer is very popular in mammals. But then you ask the question, okay, so what do I do with this, right? What can I learn? Well, this topic, you're very likely to see words like Colombia and Peru, Venezuela, and Ecuador, Panama, and Brazil. And you're very likely to see distribution and locality and genus, and you're also really likely to see neotropical. And I like that cat sneaks into the bottom here. This is pretty easy to understand, right? This is just the words that you would use when you were talking about your Central and South American collection sites. And so you read these words, it just makes sense, right? And so topic 16 is popular in mammals. That means that mammals are unusually well represented in taxonomy that takes place in Central and South American collection sites. Cool. This is why we like topic modeling as an algorithm, by the way, because normally when you read these lists of words, it makes sense. They're explicable. They act like topics in the colloquial human sense of the word topic. That's a good example. That's an example of a topic of a success in topic interpretation. Sometimes you have to be a little careful. So here's topic 31. Topic 31, so we said Lepidoptera, so that's the genus of things like butterflies, right? Cool. Scale and we got forewing, we got leg. Okay, so I'm thinking butterfly anatomy. Good, good. I've also got male, female, and genitalia and bursae. That's another part of butterfly reproductive anatomy. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm not a taxonomist. I'm really, especially doubly not a butterfly taxonomist, but I'm thinking, all right, lepidopteran reproductive classification, right? And that's cool, except there's just one problem. You do the correlation analysis that I mentioned, and you find that this topic is overrepresented, but not in insects. It's overrepresented in papers about mollusks. Now you're like, wait, what's happening? Well, the problem is that word bursae. Bursa just means sac in Latin. It's a really common taxonomic term. Anytime you got a bag hanging off of an organism, it's a bursa. Mollusks also reproduce using bursae, and so this topic that really clearly appeared from words to look like a butterfly reproductive anatomy topic equally works as the mollusk reproductive anatomy. And so this is my first sort of cautionary tale, right? You gotta be pretty careful when you interpret these kinds of things. Before I continue, I just want to really quickly show you some other like cool topics. This one's popular in every taxon except non-insect arthropods, fish, and fungi. These two things live in the water, and fungi get their own collection topic. This is just a term you use when you collect stuff in the field. So habitat area, collect, site, study, population range, specimen, individual, region, number, sample distribution, right? Just words about methodology for collecting. So one thing that you could do, for instance, is you could unpack this topic to try to learn more about how taxonomists think about their methodology. Here's the same thing for molecular approaches, gene sequencing-based approaches to doing taxonomy, which are now extremely common. It's massively important for reptiles and amphibia, birds, fish, fungi, and mammals, and it's top 5% of the 125 topics in every single group in the entire corpus. And this is stuff like analysis of molecular DNA, phylogenetic tree, gene study, support, CO. That's actually a 0-1. It's a Roman numeral, and that's a DNA barcoding thing. So this is exactly what you might expect for a molecular phylogenetics methodology topic. Again, we could unpack that and try to learn about how these guys think about what they're doing methodology. So how about disagreement? Let's go back to why we're here. I'm going to stop just showing you shiny objects. How can we approach disagreement using these kinds of methods? And so the first thing that we did is we wanted to figure out, well, how do people talk about disagreement? What words do people use when they talk about disagreement? And so, again, massive hat tip. Stein just went away, downloaded a bunch of papers where we knew people were fighting, and did a very painstaking close reading of all of those papers to try to think up a sort of grounded list of words that people seem to use when they're fighting. And we created 4 lists like that. Here's a list that we call disagreement list. I'll come back to what the other 3 are in a second. And it's got stuff like critique, doubt, opinion, disagree, redundant, reject, misunderstanding, error, obsolete, mistake, misclassify, contentious, right? It's kind of words that you would use that taxonomists themselves seem to use when they're being angry at each other in their papers. And so what we did is we made 4 lists like this. Disagreement list, we made a list of sort of epistemic value kind of terms. So when people are talking about accuracy or precision, that kind of thing, and trying to catch some of the other epistemic virtues as well. Just pejorative evaluations, so when they just insult each other in their journal articles, which actually happens all the time. Taxonomists are not nice at all. And we tried to make a more general list of words that was just like, how would you talk about just modifying taxonomy? I won't talk about this one anymore. The problem, it's too common. Those words are everywhere. So it just doesn't make sense for me to talk about the taxonomy change. But then you can ask the topic model, right? Which topics pick the disagreement words? most often, right? Which topics give the highest probability to disagreement words and other lists as well? The answer is, so disagreement itself is very popular in topic 43, epistemic values are popular in topic 91, and pejorative terms are popular in topics numbers 43 and 120. Let me unpack these. Let's start with 43. So this is high in disagreement words and pejorative language. Of course, you won't see it in these lists of terms because these are the top 20 most probable words of all. Those appear farther down the list. They just appear higher in this topic than in most others. And this includes things like species. So our text processing thinks that species is plural, so it turns into species, even though that's not a word. Oh, well, it's a word about currency. Anyway. Name, description, new, publish. You also have International Zoological Nomenclature Code, which is a set of rules for how you're supposed to introduce a species in the correct way, as well as valid lists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is the terms that you would use to present a new species. This is for a brand new species. And so you see both a lot of disagreement and a lot of pejorative language when people introduce new species. And this is a bit of an issue, I'm going to come back to it in a bit. The word synonym appears right here. Saying that one species is a synonym of another species is how you delete a species from literature, right? Like, oh, you thought these were different? No, this is a synonym for this other thing. And so actually this topic, a bit unfortunately, right, you might like to separate those two processes, creation and destruction. You don't really here. This is both the terms for creating and destroying species in the taxonomic literature. Here's 120, which is just about is important for pejorative language. It's interesting. This is cool. This is the only topic that has a high probability for names of groups above the genus level. So you see family here. So this is the only time that you see family. But also, relationship, clade, morphological, support, classification, consider. This is people arguing in here, genera, species, genus, etc. This is the terms that you use to argue about where to put a group in the hierarchy. Is it a species? Is it a genus? Is it a family? Should this genus go in this family or in this family? Right? It's about taking the existing pieces in the tree and moving them around. And they insult each other a lot when they do. So that's cool. This is, I guess I'd say both of these are neat because they confirm the kind of thing that we might have expected, but that we didn't have empirical confirmation of before. Creating species, deleting species, and re-ranking species, as we might have thought, that's where people get nasty. It wouldn't be a digital humanities talk if I didn't present at least one slide that I said I have no idea how to explain and do not understand. And so this is that slide. Topic 91 is absolutely loaded with epistemic value terms, and if you investigate its terms in great detail, it is entirely filled with terms describing the anatomy of decapod crustaceans. That makes no sense. I have no theory, I have no explanation, I have no idea. I had to actually look up how to put emojis into my slide because I wanted to put the thinking guy. I'm going to try to find out, but for that reason and this reason that I was mentioning about wanting to distinguish creation and destruction of species, it sure seems like it would be nice to distinguish a bit more precisely between these different uses of language in this context. And so what we wanted to do was think about what other methodologies we could use. And again, if you've done recent digital humanities work, you know that a very popular way to do this is what we now call vector modeling. So you train a model, largely just a neural network model. It's not that exciting. It's not AI. It's just basic machine learning. That model represents the words in the corpus in a one-dimensional vector space, and then uses that model to train a representation of every document as a vector as well within that same space. So an algorithm was developed by Google about 10 years ago now for real informatics people. This is old news. It's really fast, and it gives pretty surprisingly good results. It also makes really pretty pictures because you can visualize that 100-dimensional space. So here's all of my documents smashed into the 2-dimensional plane. One thing that you do see is, of course, there's a lot of stuff clustered near the middle, and that's just an artifact of representation thing. But these clusters that are a bit farther removed are largely clusters that talk about different kinds of organisms. And I remember I wanted to have one that I could give you as an example. This guy here, the pale green one at the top middle, that's all spiders. That's all about spiders. So just to give you an idea, right? That's a nice confirmation. It seems like the algorithm is distinguishing papers pretty well based on its content. But then what we can do, we can represent those disagreement terms, those lists of terms that we came up with earlier, as a kind of document and put them in the vector space. So we'll have a vector that's like, this is a being disagreeable vector, right? And then we can ask, well, what documents are closest to being disagreeable vector, right? What documents live in the highly disagreeable region of syntactic space? Very difficult graph to interpret. This is the same image as before, although with the bright yellow dots being the very low disagreement, papers that are very far from the disagreement vector, and the bright green dots being papers that are very close to the disagreement vector. All that I want to say about this, the reason that I created this image is, this is actually what I wanted to see. Namely, there's some differentiation in the yellow and green dots, so they're not completely uniform, but neither are they totally clustered. So if all the disagreement was in one tiny point on, again, this image that, as I mentioned, basically is clustering things by what kind of species they talk about, right? That would be a big problem. But no, they're slightly differentially spread, but not completely, which is sort of what you expect with respect to species. So now what I can do is I can make new little baby corpora of 5,000 most and least disagreeable papers. So the 5,000 papers that are closest to the disagreement vector and the 5,000 papers that are farthest from the disagreement vector. And then I can say, take all the species names out and look at relative risk ratios. Just what's more likely, what kinds of species are more likely to show up in disagreeable articles. And you see the following. I think these numbers are a little bit out of date. I've rerun the analysis, but it didn't delete anything from this list. You see more disagreement, much more disagreement, when people talk about mammals. Almost fourfold in this initial analysis. More disagreement when people talk about birds. Fungi, of course, as noted, my sample size is small, so this is dubious. And fish, normally 2 is about the threshold for significance of relative risk, right? So fish maybe. You see notably less, it's well under 0.5. You see about half as much disagreement in insect people. So insect, if you want to be a taxonomist, the insect people are nice. You can go hang out with them. Another thing that you can do is you can start to use other algorithms to unpack more words. So, okay, we had our list of hand-curated disagreement terms, but what other words, other than that list, distinguish disagreement papers from non-disagreement papers? And here I'm using actually a stylometric analysis. I can talk more about this algorithm later. I have like 2 minutes left to get through these last 2 slides. I'm fine. What words distinguish those two corpora? Disagreement papers well, there's a lot of things that I could say about this. It's interesting to see revision here, right? It's interesting to see case. Of course, now synonym and synonym show up. So there's a lot of disagreement when you're fighting about whether or not to delete a species. Another thing that's really interesting is that you fight when you're in Western Europe, and you don't fight when you're in China. Just off the diagram here is you don't fight when you're in India either. And I don't think this is just cultural. I think this is, look, there's 400 years of dead white guys doing taxonomy for the same 8 species in Western Europe, right? What's happening in China and India is we haven't even categorized the biodiversity in China and India fully yet. So people don't have time to fight. They're too busy trying to figure out what lives over here. What do we do with this stuff? And so this is actually a hypothesis that we had already had previously. Stein's group had proposed that probably in these richer, less explored regions, there's going to be a lot less fighting. There's an interesting linguistic problem here too, because there's also a really, really rich taxonomic literature in Chinese that I can't access. So that's very interesting. I'm going to put that on the table and walk away from it. So this is really cool. This is exactly the kind of stuff that we had hoped to be able to do, right? How can we unpack how it is that people talk about disagreement? What are they fighting about, and what else are they doing? In what contexts when they disagree about taxonomy? I think already you could run with this and try to make more sophisticated philosophical analyses of these cases. The next thing that I want to do, I don't know how yet, because I tried to talk to this about this with Google, and they literally ghosted me. They were working with me very closely, and we just stopped answering my emails. But I would love to do, just like I did extracting species names from the paper, I would love to extract place names from all these papers. Because then you can correlate agreement and disagreement with where in the world are you? What are you talking about? What regions are you studying? I don't know how to do that. But with that, I'm really excited to have questions. As always, huge thanks to the other people in my group. There's 2 other people in my group on this project, and the FNS pays the bills. So thanks to the FNS, including my bills to be here right now, which is also cool. So yeah, thank you.
Right. So that's the floor is open for questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm quite interested in the methodology part, I guess, from social science background.
Oh yeah, cool.
Like textual that's interesting to me. So you mentioned you could talk a bit more about the topic. What is it?
Done. Yeah, so I think this is a good, there's another way, when I have more time to introduce it slower, this is how I introduce it. So maybe this will be helpful. The way the topic modeling works is you pick one parameter, you pick the number of topics that you want to cut your documents into. And then you assume the following. You say, imagine that we wrote a document in the following way, which of course we don't, but imagine. Imagine that we wrote a document by consulting first, for that document, its own probability distribution over every topic. So every document will mix the topics together in a different way. And then we pick a topic. And then that topic is a probability distribution over every word. And then we pick a word. And then we repeat until we have however many words there are in the document. So we say, this is how people write. We propose that as our model of writing, and then we tell the computer, okay, so there's n documents in my corpus and k topics, there's n plus k probability distributions to come up with, right? And we tell the computer, go to work, and it does. And this is where the magic happens, right? It turns out that those k topic distributions, even though this model is obviously a garbage representation of writing, even though it pretends, very interestingly and very importantly, that words aren't directly related to one another, right? There's not sequence. There's no order. It's just frequencies. But it turns out that even when you have that model that makes all of those obviously false assumptions, the topics work and they're really interesting. So yeah, that's how the model works. It's just inferring a bunch of probability distributions. And it just so it turns out that gives you a pretty good handle on what's happening in the world. Yeah, it's really bizarre and fun. I enjoy it.
Chris?
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really interesting talk. So just wondering if you said more about how the links up. So the kind of analysis to the stuff you were talking about at the start. So you were saying like got this idea about okay, biodiversity, what is that? And then something about maybe diversity of species or whatever. But then you have this, this image, from science or nature or something. There's this taxonomic or something.
Yeah, good.
But actually, at the end, what the picture seemed to be saying was, in let's say Europe or Western Europe or something, where it's maybe less biodiverse, you might intuitively think. That's where most of the disagreement is. But actually, in these countries where it seems to be very biodiverse, or at least we haven't got a handle on it yet, kind of level of that diversity, that's where there's less disagreement. So I was wondering, what's the
Yeah, good. I mean, this is what we're sort of wrestling with now. Is what ought one conclude from the empirical analyses? The first thing to say is, I think you're exactly right. So here's the thing that you might be worried about, right? You might be worried that taxonomic practice. So this is where I'm going to agree and disagree in what I think is what I hope is a nuanced way. One thing that you might be worried about is taxonomic practice biased by either your sort of perceived threat. So like how worried are you about biodiversity laws, which is going to be somewhat geographic, right? Or by your exposure to biodiversity, how much you get to see in your research practice. The interesting thing is that you might think that bias cuts in multiple different ways, right? Because you might worry that, so if I'm really worried about biodiversity, maybe what I try to do is I try to cut up the species into very small species, because then they're all threatened. And maybe I attract a lot of attention to my area, right? Or I use different kinds of analysis tools. You might also be interested in whether